It's easy to oversimplify the role of language in a culture. You've probably heard the old chestnut that the Eskimo or Inuit have hundreds of words for snow. That's actually wrong. It turns out to be different forms of the same word for snow. But I think the core idea is valid. First, vocabulary does tell us about what's important to a civilization. The Native Americans of Vancouver Island have dozens of words for salmon. The Sami people of Lapland have hundreds of words for reindeer. And as for the French, well, General de Gaulle famously complained, "How can you govern a country that has 246 kinds of cheese?" But beyond the importance of specific words, language structures make it easier or more difficult to express certain things, such as social status, attitudes towards gender, and emotional states. So I think it's fair to ask the question, what does the Japanese language tell us about Japanese culture? What does it tell us about what people value? Well, as we'll learn today, Japanese language is highly contextual. It's hard to know how to say something in Japanese unless you know the details of the social context. And that reflects a long-standing Japanese concern with order, with hierarchy, and with consensus. We'll also see that Japan has one of the most complex writing systems in the world. And that's largely because Japan adopted ideographic Chinese characters, that is, a foreign script system, even though it has no intrinsic syntactical relation to spoken Japanese. Now, this borrowing of the Chinese script system is just one example of China's deep influence on Japanese culture. And we'll explore some of the linguistic consequences of this influence in a few moments. But first, let's examine the idea I just mentioned, the idea that Japan is contextual and situational, the idea that we need to know the context in Japanese before we can say anything. So many years ago, I was asked to work as a consultant on a short elementary school book. The book was called A Look at Japan, and it should have been a fairly simple job, except that the book was part of a series. And each book in the series began with how to say hello in the language of the country the children were pretending to visit. And this turned out to be a big problem, because there's no simple hello in Japanese. You can say good morning, or good day, or good night, but the only way to say hello in Japanese is haro. So translating something seemingly simple, like hello, is not simple at all. Hello in the morning in Japanese is good morning or ohayo. And that becomes ohayo gozaimasu in a formal situation. Hello during the day is good day or konnichiwa. And in the evening, hello is good evening or konbanwa. So, point one, Japanese is highly situational. When translating something into Japanese, you often need to know the time of day, the time of year, the formality of the situation, the age, the gender, the social status of the speaker, the age, the gender, the social status of the addressee, the age, the gender, and the social status of any third party mentioned, and then the social connections among the speaker, the listener, and the third parties. Are they family members? Do they work for the same company? Needless to say, this is a little bit beyond the abilities of Google Translate. And it makes Japanese arguably the opposite of contemporary American English, which has lost almost all markers of social hierarchy in speech. French has tu and vous, German has du and sie, but American English just has you. So translating the English please or thank you or how are you into idiomatic Japanese becomes astonishingly complicated. Because we need to know, is a mother talking to her young son? is an employee talking to her boss, is a college student talking to a friend. But let me give you some concrete examples of how this works. When I say Japanese is situational, we can think of each speech situation as having a position on two axes. One is the social hierarchy axis. Some people are above the speaker, and some people are below the speaker. The second axis is formality. Is it a casual situation or a formal situation? And almost every Japanese verb is different based on these two axes. In fact, Japanese adjectives and many nouns also vary based on these two axes. To see this in action, let's analyze the following situation. A group of Japanese friends from college, they get together for a beer and one says, "Hey, I saw our favorite teacher, Professor Tanaka, the other day. He's retired, but he's healthy and happy." So let's think about our two axes, social hierarchy and formality. Well, clearly the situation is informal, but Professor Tanaka is the social superior to all the friends. So as a result, the speaker's language has to be honorific but informal. So the guy says, "I saw Professor Tanaka as Tanaka-sensei ni omeni kakatta." Literally, my eyes respectfully fell upon Professor Tanaka. Omeni kakaru is a respectful phrase that signals the social superiority of the professor. My eyes fell upon instead of just see or meet. But kakatta is the informal form of kakaru because we're amongst friends. Okay, let's tweak this scenario a little bit. Same people, talking about the same professor, but this time the context is not so informal. Maybe we're in front of other people. So omeni kakatta becomes omeni kakarimashita, which is the same verb but now in formal form. That longer mashita at the end tells us that it's formal. Okay, one more tweak. Same people, same formal situation, but let's say the subject of the conversation is different. Maybe the conversation is about an old mutual friend instead of the professor. Now that old mutual friend, he's at the same social position as the classmates, so we need to use a neutral verb for to see or to meet, maybe dao. So I might say, Tanaka-kun ni deaimashita. I bumped into Tanaka-kun. So first, let's observe that kun is attached to the old friend's name. Kun marks familiarity, especially amongst men. And second, although the root verb dao is socially neutral, it takes the form deaimashita because we're still in a formal situation. In other words, even though Tanaka is a mutual friend, the verb needs to reflect the contextual mood. Now, as in the previous case, I can make things informal with the shorter verb ending, deatta, instead of deaimashita. So if we're back at the bar with friends, talking about an old mutual friend, I'd say Tanaka-kun ni deatta. So think of those two axes. Is the person under discussion above me, a peer, or below me? And two, is this a formal or a casual situation? Now, to English speakers, this might seem rather complicated, but it helps explain how even basic phrases work in Japanese. For example, nothing really corresponds to the English phrase, please. Now, many phrase books often give kudasai as the translation of please, and certainly it has that overall meaning. But kudasai makes more sense in terms of an axis of social hierarchy. Kudasai comes from the verb kudasaru, which means send it down. So saying kudasai marks the speaker as socially below the listener. But that humility is balanced by the form of the verb. The sai suffix is actually a mild command. So kudasai is the gentle command form of the verb kudasaru. So please in Japanese is, could you send it down? By now, you've probably noticed that stuff happens at the end of Japanese verbs. And it's tempting to call this conjugating, but linguists call it agglutinating. Japanese verbs and adjectives add information by adding suffixes. Okay, here's a good example. In English, if the verb is eat, the past passive is was eaten. In Japanese, the verb for eat, taberu, becomes taberareta, was eaten. The past passive voice is indicated by a suffix. So, where English adds words, Japanese adds suffixes. Let's look at another example of agglutination. In English, adjectives don't have a tense. Take, for example, the phrase is delicious and the phrase was delicious. The adjective delicious doesn't change from present to past. The sense of time comes from the verb. But in Japanese, the adjective for delicious is oishii in the present, and it changes to oishikatta in the past. The past tense of an adjective is marked with a suffix. And indeed, the more complicated the sentence, the more stuff happens at the end of Japanese words. So in English, a sentence that needs lots of additional words, in Japanese, it just gets lots of suffixes. Okay, here's a silly example. Although it was delicious, it did not want to be eaten. So in Japanese, that would be oishikatta ga taberaretaku nakatta. So in English, to get that thought across, you use lots of words. But in Japanese, it's just the words delicious, but, and eat, and then a negative past marker, nakatta. All those helper words in English, they become suffixes in Japanese. So we've identified two key features of the Japanese language. Feature 1, Japanese is highly context dependent. And feature 2, Japanese agglutinates. Now to Westerners, these features may make Japanese syntax seem truly weird. And certainly Japanese is quite different from Romance and Germanic languages. But Japanese is absolutely not unique. In fact, Japanese is similar to a string of languages that run along the Silk Road. Japanese, Korean, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, Persian, Armenian, and Turkish. All of these languages agglutinate. And they have very few irregular verbs, but their verbs take lots of suffixes. And because of these similarities, native speakers of Turkish can learn Japanese much more rapidly than native speakers of English. And conversely, when I was traveling in Turkey, I discovered that knowing Japanese helped me make sense of Turkish syntax. Okay, before we leave the second feature, agglutination, let me make one more observation. So far, we've been focusing on how Japanese says things. But just as important as how Japanese says things is what it does not say. Or rather, what's explicit in English but implied in Japanese. For example, Japanese routinely drops pronouns. You rarely say I, me, and you in Japanese. They are not needed. That's largely because those reference points are clear from other parts of the sentence, usually from suffixes to verbs or the type of verb. Think about it. Since we're marking social position in grammar, we really don't need to say explicitly I or me. If the verb is humbly send it down, do I really need to say I humbly ask you to send it down? I and you are just needless extra words. In fact, when the Japanese want to make fun of how Americans sound when they're trying to speak Japanese, they emphatically add words like I and you because it sounds so weird. For example, watashi wa anata ga itta koto ga wakarimasen is a direct translation of I don't understand what you said. And it sounds completely idiotic. The idiomatic Japanese is just one word, wakarimasen, don't understand. Instead of saying you in Japanese, speakers will commonly use the person's name with a suffix. And, not surprisingly, that suffix marks social status. So if you're talking to Mr. Tanaka, rather than say you, you'd say Tanaka-san. San is the honorific suffix. Or maybe Tanaka-sama, an extra honorific. If he's an old friend, it's Tanaka-kun. Kun is familiar, used primarily by men. And those suffixes, like sama, can attach to things other than names. One of my favorite Japanese phrases is otsukare-sama. Sama attached to the word for tired, which is a polite way of saying you must be tired, but literally it is Honorable Mr. and Mrs. Tired. There are pronouns in Japanese, words for I and you, but those usually come with extra meaning. For example, according to most phrase books, anata is supposedly you in Japanese. But anata has the nuance of a wife talking to her husband. And therefore, if a wife used anata in speaking to her husband, he would never say anata back, but instead he'd say something like kimi. And similarly, first-person pronouns tend to add information about the speaker. Phrase books often say that I in Japanese is watashi, and that works as a fairly neutral, formal first-person pronoun. But there's also atashi, an informal I, usually used by women. Boku, that's used by men and boys in casual situations. Ore is a very informal male first-person pronoun. So these are all different I's and U's with extra socially dense implications. Okay, to recap. First, Japanese is highly situational, and nothing, not even pronouns or adjectives, are socially neutral. And second, situational meanings are conveyed through agglutination. Okay, now, as an agglutinating language, Japanese is very different from English and other Western languages. But remarkably, Japanese is also very different from Chinese. And that leads to the third key feature I want to highlight today. Japanese writing is incredibly complex because it's written using a Chinese-based script system, even though Chinese is structurally unrelated to Japanese. Practically, writing Japanese in a Chinese-based script is like writing French with hieroglyphics. And as a result, Japanese has one of the strangest writing systems in the world. Japanese is full of workarounds to adapt Chinese orthography to Japanese syntax. Well, how and why did that happen? Well, Japanese was a fully developed language, fully developed spoken language by the 400s. It had words for all sorts of basic stuff. Eat, drink, fight, laugh, dog, cat, chicken, fox, hot, cold, wet, dry. But there was no written language. The earliest fragments of writing in Japan are from the 400s, and writing did not become widespread for hundreds of years. It must have seemed sensible in ancient Japan to adapt the Chinese writing system rather than to reinvent the wheel. But it led to two quirks of the Japanese language. One quirk is a double vocabulary. When the Japanese imported Chinese characters, they also imported the Chinese sounds for those characters. So in Japan, almost every Chinese character has two possible readings: the local Japanese reading and a copy of the Chinese pronunciation. Here's an example. The word tonkotsu in the popular dish tonkotsu ramen. Tonkotsu is written with the Chinese character for pig and bone. It's ramen with a rich broth from pork bones. But the common Japanese word for pig is buta, not ton. And the common Japanese word for bone is hone, not kotsu. Buta and hone are the old indigenous words because they were Japanese words for pigs and for bones long before anyone tried to write anything down. But with the importation of Chinese characters, with the importation of those glyphs, came the Chinese sounds. So the ancient Japanese attempt to say pig in Chinese is ton, and the ancient Japanese attempt to say bone in Chinese is kotsu. And by convention, when we put those two characters together, we get tonkotsu. We use the Chinese readings, even though in a different situation, you might read those same characters as buta and hone. It's possible to recreate this partly in English because English also sometimes has a double vocabulary. English has an older Germanic vocabulary drawn from its Anglo-Saxon roots, and also a huge lexicon of more sophisticated words from the Romance languages. So a colloquial term for the house pet that chases mice and plays with string is cat. That's like the German Katz. But the more sophisticated term is feline, from the Latin feles. Now in English, cat and feline are spelled completely differently, but in the Japanese case, those two words would be written with the same character. And the distinction between cat and feline would be based on context. Okay, here's a real example from Japanese. The two characters for house and make can be read in three different ways. The character for house has the older indigenous Japanese reading of ie and also ya. And make has the older indigenous reading of tsukuru, the Japanese verb for make. But the character for house can also have the Chinese style reading of ka, and make can have the Chinese reading of saku. So these two characters together can be read as iezukuri, yazukuri, or kasaku, depending on the context. Okay, so the first important consequence of using Chinese to write Japanese is having this doubled vocabulary. The second major consequence is that Japanese needed an additional orthography in order for Japanese people to truly express themselves in Japanese. The Japanese language actually has two phonetic systems to supplement Chinese. Why? Remember all those suffixes that give Japanese verbs their meaning? Well, since Chinese is not agglutinating, there's no easy way to represent those suffixes using actual Chinese characters. So the Japanese developed two phonetic systems to fill the gap, hiragana and katakana. Both are derived from Chinese characters, but they are so highly simplified, they look more like letters than like characters, and they're used only for sound. So, modern Japanese has three different writing systems. But everyone in Japan also knows Roman letters, and Roman letters are commonly used in daily life. So it's actually four writing systems. And if you add Arabic numbers, it's 5. That's unquestionably the most complicated writing system in the world. So, we've talked about the importance of context in Japanese, and we've also discussed agglutination and the idiosyncrasies associated with a borrowed writing system. For a fourth and final point, I want to mention one of my favorite aspects of Japanese. Its rich vocabulary of onomatopoetic words. Now, onomatopoeia refers to words that imitate sounds. In English, moo is a good example, and so is oink, and so is meow. But more important is that Japanese uses onomatopoetic words for things that aren't noisy. For example, to be lively or healthy in Japanese is pinpin suru. It's to be pinpin. To be irritated or angry is ira-ira suru. To be ira-ira. Sometimes the sound changes with the intensity. Kira-kira is to shine brightly, and even brighter is gira-gira. But perhaps the most striking example is that Japanese has an onomatopoetic word for silence. Shin, or shinto, means silently. So yes, with apologies to both Simon and Garfunkel, in Japanese there is a sound of silence. Now these words can be combined to create new words, and here's an example that's known worldwide. In Japanese, to sparkle is pika pika, and a mouse in Japanese makes the sound choo choo. Hence the Pokemon, Pikachu. It's the electric shining mouse. Now this may seem strange. What does it mean that the Japanese have a sound for irritation, there's a sound for a messy desk, and there's a sound for silence. Well, one argument is that Japanese brains are closer to nature, that they are tuned into sounds that only they can hear. Now that to me is crazy, like the arguments that Japanese intestines can only digest Japanese beef, or that Japanese skis work especially well on Japanese snow. And remember, American English also allows for sound mimesis, wham and pow and sako. And I think the Yiddish term kvetch has done so well in English because it has an onomatopoetic aspect. And if I describe a new colleague as hardworking but kind of frumpy-lumpy, I don't think people will complain that frumpy-lumpy is not in the dictionary. But Japanese allows these expressions in formal speech. In Japanese, onomatopoetic words aren't just silly like wham and sako. They can be part of a learned vocabulary. In other words, Japanese allows for lots of contained playfulness. Yes, the language has lots of rules, but it also offers lots of places to play within those rules. And that leads back to some generalizations we can make about Japanese culture based on the language. So first and foremost, as we've seen, you can't say anything in Japanese without knowing the social standing of the various people. And conveying this in grammar means that you can actually tell when you've been accepted as a member of a group. Now, speaking from experience, as a foreign student, as long as your professor uses the honorific, you have not been accepted. You are an outsider. And therefore, the first time the professor shifts grammar and moves you down, it's a cause for celebration. The professor has accepted you. You are now, like the other native-born students in his class, below him as a student. And that means the professor is invested in your success because you're now part of his group. Your success reflects back on him. So if you're in Japan on business, the first time a colleague says, "Your idea stinks," it is great. Great news, you're an insider. And if that conversation is in Japanese, that change will actually be marked by new verbs with new suffixes and new grammatical forms. And maybe your colleague will switch from san to kun, and that's all part of accepting you, bringing you closer, which now means she can say, "Your idea stinks." Now this happens in all cultures. Think of this simple shift from vous to tu in French. And that just means, let's be closer, let's be less formal. But in Japanese, this grammatical shifting is remarkably rich and dense. Social relationships are wired into the language, and shifts in these relationships are conveyed by variations in nouns and verbs and adjectives. In fact, the Japanese language reflects the long-standing Japanese sense that everything will go best if everyone knows their place and everyone follows the rules. But the Japanese also value consensus, and that means it's awkward to explicitly insist on following the rules. In fact, one of the most striking things about daily life in Japan is how rarely anyone explicitly says no. That's just too vulgar. It's too overtly confrontational. And therefore, many aspects of the Japanese language involve seemingly elliptical ways of saying no, without ever using an overt negative. Okay, let me give you two examples. One famous and one personal. In 1969, President Nixon and Japanese Prime Minister Sato Eisaku met at the White House. And in conversation, Nixon asked Sato for voluntary Japanese restrictions on textile exports. Cheap Japanese textiles were wiping out jobs in the US, and that was hurting Nixon politically. So Sato responded, "Mai muki ni kento shimashou," which literally means, let's examine this with a forward-looking perspective, which is completely evasive, and therefore it meant no. But that nuance was lost in translation, and Nixon came away convinced that Sato was going to restrict textile exports. And when Sato did nothing of the sort, Nixon was furious. Some argue that Nixon later retaliated by neglecting to give Japan any advance notice when Nixon decided to fly to China to meet Mao 2 years later. That snub was retaliation for Sato's lie. Except that Sato didn't lie. He just gave a marvelously conflict-averse Japanese answer, notably a sentence lacking a subject, a sentence that could have meant, "I will consider it," or maybe "we should consider it." Now, I learned about this incident in college, but I was still unprepared to encounter it myself. Although for me, it just involved bringing an electronic dictionary into an archive, not a major trade agreement. I had my notepad and my pencil bag and a calculator-sized electronic dictionary in my hand, and I went to enter the library, and I was stopped at the sign-in desk with the phrase, "It's the rules of the library, but could you please show restraint in the use of computers?" And that meant you can't bring in the electronic dictionary. To which I responded in Japanese, "It's not a computer, it's a small pocket dictionary." To which the librarian answered, "The honorable use of electronic dictionaries is currently under discussion. Denshi jishu no goriyou wa soudan ni natte orimasu." Now, I should have known that under discussion meant no. No, no, no. But I took it literally. It's under discussion. Someone was in a room right then, maybe in a back room, discussing whether the regulation against computers applied to little electronic dictionaries. And maybe if I waited 10 minutes, the meeting would be over and they'd let me in. And I was with a Japanese colleague, and he found the entire exchange both amusing and appalling. Now, I don't want to imply that these sorts of elliptical statements are uniquely Japanese. There are plenty of examples in English of polite phrases where the intended meaning is the opposite of the literal meaning. "I will take it under consideration" in many contexts just means no. But the structure of the Japanese language means that those linguistic moves can be even richer and more subtle, that there are even more ways to say no without saying no, and ways of saying "I won't let you do that" without ever using the pronouns I or you. And that richness is precious in a society that values consensus.